And now from the book of Joshua, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Then Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and spent the night there. The king of Jericho was told, "Some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land." Then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the whole land." But the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Then she said, "True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when it was time to close the gate at dark, the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them." She had, however, brought them up onto the roof. So the men pursued them on the way to the Jordan, as far as the fords. As soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. And now a reading from James, chapter 2, verses 14 through 17. And I believe verses 24 to 26 are not in the bulletin, but I'm going to add those. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Surely that faith cannot save, can it? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. First of all, I have to embarrass my teenage son, Liam, who is here and is slaying. And I realized that one way to get your teenagers and friends to church is to take the pulpit. Actually, I think most teenagers would be embarrassed by their mom taking the pulpit. So I appreciate them this morning. You know, last Saturday, Pastor Ron gave an amazing sermon, if you were here, called "Be Grateful and Never Lose Heart." And if you recall, the opening scripture was, "Then Jesus told them a parable about their needs to pray always and not lose heart." When I saw this, I went up to Pastor Ron afterwards and I said, "You know, God really has a sense of humor. Your opening scripture is about pray always, and the title of my sermon next weekend is Beyond Prayers and Platitudes." But of course, I think his sermon and my sermon, you will find, are 2 sides of the same coin, and that one cannot exist without the other. So I'm also going to open with a parable, because that was one of Jesus's favorite ways of teaching the scripture. And it is a parable about a monk who you've probably heard before that mirrors the scripture reading. There was a young monk who was told to pray for all who suffer. And one day, a hungry beggar came to the monastery and told the brother he was looking for food. The monk stretched out his hand, put it on the man's shoulder, and prayed that God would be with him and that his belly would be full of good things. Later that night, the monk went back for dinner. The abbot was there. And the abbot asked the young monk, "How was your day?" And he was so excited. "There was a beggar who came, and he was hungry, and I prayed for him." The abbot listened intently and then gently asked, "And did you feed the man?" The monk, looking perplexed, shook his head. "No, I did not." Then the abbot smiled warmly. "Then, dear brother," he said, "your prayer is only halfway finished." So October 7th is my birthday, was my birthday. But I believe we can all say that October 7th was also the beginning of a deeply painful reminder of the state of affairs of our world. Like you, I found myself trying to get to my knees in prayer. If you recall, around October 7th coincided also about a week and a half later with the mass shooting in Maine, where 18 lives were taken. There is so much tragedy. In times of tragedy, we Christians and people of all faith are called to prayer. But I have to be honest with you, sometimes it feels trite. Sometimes it feels hollow. I paused before giving the sermon today that I'm going to give on the week of Thanksgiving, where we tend to focus on our bounty and the joy and the fullness in our tummies and hearts. And all of that is true. And it's also true that in the midst of our prayers, I think it's important to pause, particularly this week, and have a true understanding of what the suffering looks like in the world. Now, I'm going to give my first of two legal disclaimers. I would never pretend to be any kind of historical or cultural expert on what's taking place in the Middle East. And I know that Micah, I believe it was in the October 26th Foxfire, gives us some wonderful resources that we can turn to understand more what's going on in Palestine and Israel, not only the historical context, but the true point of view of those who find themselves in the middle of that. Because I am, as many of you know, a trial attorney by heart, any good trial attorney is only as good as the visuals they give to the jury. I like my, what they call illustrative exhibits. So when I'm pausing with you today, I've maybe inartfully, maybe somewhat artfully, I have some squares up there that I'd like to give as a visual aid to today's sermon. The first visual you'll see is the red, green, and blue rectangles. Since October 7th, 12,000 people have died in Israel and Gaza. Each of those squares represents 1,000 people. The squares to the left, the 7 is roughly 7,000 adults, and I'm going to say in air quotes, adults have lost their lives. 5,000 children have lost their lives. I'd originally put 4 squares up there this morning, and then my partner Chris reminded me, no, the death toll's risen, Michelle. It should be 5 squares. 12,000 lives, over half the population in that area is under the age of 18. 1 in every 200 people at this point have lost their lives. And that's not to mention the hospitals, power, lack of food and water. The Washington Post did a great visual of what's going on now, one that I wished I could have recreated for you. And it embedded, instead of squares, it was with dots for every human life lost. And embedded in those dots was this beautiful, beautiful portrait of a young girl named Hala Mufid Abu Sadah. 14, she loved drawing, dancing, singing, and she and her 5 siblings and mothers were killed in the airstrike on October 16th. 87 other children died that day. And I would be remiss if I stopped there, and I will get to the positive, I promise, uplifting part. But it's also equally important this week of Thanksgiving to think about the indigenous cultures in our land. And so I would turn your attention to the yellow squares over there. And while the red, green, and blue represents 1,000, the yellow squares, there's 12 of them, each one represents 1,000,000 lives. From 1492 to 1900, in North America alone, we're not talking about in Latin America, over 12 million indigenous people lost their lives to either war, famine, or outbreaks of smallpox. We remember that this week when we're holding gratitude. And finally, the red squares on the right, there's 6 of them. Each of them represents 100 lives. To date in this country, this year alone, we have lost 600 people to mass shootings. So when we talk about prayer, I want us to think about it in this context. When we offer our thoughts and prayers, is that enough? We offer thoughts and prayers, don't we, for mass shootings? We offer thoughts and prayers and pray for peace in the Middle East. But you see, the problem itself is not prayer. The Middle East desperately needs our prayers. The families of the victims of mass shootings need our prayers. The healing that we need to bring to the land in indigenous cultures needs our prayers. But this is what I want you to take away from this morning. When prayer becomes a platitude or a platform for inaction, that's where we get ourselves in trouble. Jesus came down in human form to teach us about a living God and love, and that living God resides in all of us. Because it is up to us. If not you, then who? If by love to give away, which I love that theme for this month, means that we make prayer a verb and that we make love a verb, well, then we're getting close, folks. You see, going back to the scripture, James was talking to the early church when he talked about, excuse me, that faith without works is dead. And what he was trying to say to that early church, because they were models, right, for everyone, if you're gonna talk the talk, then you better walk the walk. He was telling the early church, you cannot rely on words alone. This echoes what Paul says in Galatians. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. So what can we do? I'd like to call this prayer and. First of all, pray with context, stay informed, speak truth, and educate yourselves. I'm going to turn over my partner, Chris Britt. Some of you may know is an amazing editorial cartoonist. I've left these on the altar intentionally because they're can be graphic for some people, but they illustrate some of the topics we've talked about. And I'd invite you after the service, probably without children, to reflect on those and give yourself another visual aid, such as the squares, about what we're praying for. So the prayer and pray about mass shootings and advocate for a solution for the number one killer now in the US of children, firearms. Pray for Gaza and support aid organizations and stay informed. Pray for our Indigenous brothers and sisters and honor and respect the land that we're on. Pray for the unhoused, and like Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, support things like Habitat for Humanity. And gosh dang it, pray for Margaret Henning and her brother, and if she needs keys and a Wi-Fi code, give that to her, my brothers and sisters. You see, most of this congregation does treat prayer and love as a verb. Orphans in Africa, our food bank, LGBTQ awareness and advocacy, detention ministry. These are wonderful things. These are verbs. So I'll leave you with this final point, and it may be the most important one. I want to allow space for the fact that sometimes all we can do is fall to our knees in prayer, either because of the gravity of the situation, our health, our age and stage in life. And so, hearkening back to that beautiful image of Pastor Ron's grandmother rocking in her rocking chair, reading her Bible and saying her prayers, sometimes that's enough too.